All right. Buongiorno. Good morning. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've been reminded of. In the past 10 months, my team has been working on a lot of new AI features. And many things about this are completely new. The speed of the technology, how we've developed, the way teams have worked together. And one of the things that keeps coming up to me is that it's also extremely similar to the development work and design work I've done in the past, which is that we're from different disciplines, different countries, our customers are from all around the world, but our brains are all really similar. And if there's one thing that your prospective users and you have in common, no matter what else is true, it's that we really, really hate feeling stupid. And we will do almost anything to avoid that feeling, whether it's conscious or not. And so we have these thoughts in our head that make us uncomfortable, and our brains immediately want to turn them off because we don't like that feeling. And that drives a surprising amount of the decisions we make. One of the biggest things that stops what we do or how we behave is this philosophy called cognitive dissonance. And that's just the name for that really uncomfortable feeling when you have two or more conflicting ideas in your head at the same time. And our brains don't like that. They want to get us out of that as quickly as possible. And I think one of the ways that we see this come out the most is we think of ourselves as smart, thoughtful builders, designers, and developers. We spend all day thinking about our problems. We spend all day practicing our craft. And so surely we must build really good stuff. And then we see customers or prospective users who struggle with the things we've built. And this has a clash in our brain. We're like, wait, how can these two things be true? I'm working so hard, I must be good at this, and yet people are struggling. And sometimes you'll hear this come out as people saying, users just don't get it. They don't understand. Maybe we're talking to dumb users. I feel like that's a little bit at the extreme end, but it's really just saying out loud what most of our brains are kind of whispering, like maybe they just don't get it. But even at the level beyond that, when we've kind of accepted that, like, yes, we should listen to users, there's still things that we do to sabotage ourselves and to keep ourselves from hearing those uncomfortable truths. And one of those is that in order for our brains to be safe from this cognitive dissonance, we really lean in to the methodology that prevents us from hearing uncomfortable things. If you've ever thought, I'll send a survey instead of talking to a customer, and that's pretty easy to justify, right? It's fast, it's cheap, we could reach 100 people instead of talking to 2 people. Surely that's worthwhile. Maybe we're lucky enough to have really good analytics. We say, great, we're going to analyze a funnel. That will show us for sure what users are doing and feeling. When we do talk to them, maybe we ask multiple choice questions. We accept these really short answers. And what we're really doing is setting a ceiling on how bad the feedback can get. Because if you stick to these methods, I guarantee there's only so bad you're going to feel about hearing people answer questions like this. It might be a little bit bad, but you might get some 0-star ratings. But for the most part, you can kind of feel like, hey, things are pretty good. Things are not that bad. On the flip side, let's think about our users. They are not sure how to get started. If you've ever seen someone holding their phone in their hand and kind of doing this, like, oh, what's going to happen if I tap the screen? That is a very uncomfortable feeling. If someone's pulling down to refresh and it's not refreshing, or they go to click on something but then the page reloads, so they clicked on the wrong thing and now they have to go back, or they were really sure that the thing they needed to do was in the menu item here, but then they click and it's not there, all of those things make them feel stupid. And they kind of worry, like, maybe it's just me. And then maybe they don't want to talk to you, like, I don't want that person to think that I don't know how to use this. And even if they know it's not them, they can almost feel, as they're describing their problems, like, that guy's going to think this is just me. And so it makes us, as users, actually kind of happy when we see surveys and 5-star ratings, because we don't have to embarrass ourselves. We can just write something. We never have to see someone's face. We can just send off what seems like very easily justifiable answers that no one will question. And we don't have to say things like, I kind of wanted to use a template, but I couldn't figure out where the templates were, and then I clicked on one, and then it didn't do what I expected, and then I just was like, oh, I've been doing this for 10 minutes, I gotta throw it out and start over. And you're saying that, and as you're saying it, you're thinking, they think I'm an idiot. So on both sides, our brains are kind of conspiring against us. We're not asking the right questions, our users are not giving us the right answers, and what this means is we'll keep building things that don't really work, and they'll keep having these solutions that don't really work. It's a mess. One of the things that happens, as I talked about people not wanting to feel stupid, a lot of this has to do with another cognitive bias, social desirability bias. And that's that we give answers that other people will view as favorable. And we might minimize something bad that happens, we might overemphasize something good that happens. And so what you'll see when you have social desirability bias at work is if you have an app or a website and you know there are problems with it, maybe you were looking at your analytics, you know that people are not checking out their cart, and you ask someone, did you have trouble using this? And they say, it was okay. That is social desirability bias at work. This is someone who's like, I actually had a problem, maybe it's just me, I'm just gonna say it was okay. I worked for several years in the dev tools area, and so I spent a lot of time doing interviews with developers. And I would see my colleagues ask a question like, well, how did you find the setup? And they'd say, I figured it out. I was like, oh, we don't really want you spending your energy figuring out how to get started with our product. We want your energy on actually writing algorithms. But that's, as problem solvers, of course, they weren't going to say it was terrible. They would do this, I'll figure it out. Pro tip there, the best way we found to get around that is we started asking them instead, what advice would you give a new teammate to help them get onboarded really fast? And then they would say, oh, okay. So when you set up, skip this step, go to this step, this blog post is useless, this one is crap, go right here, read this, watch this YouTube video, and they would basically tell us the entire workaround setup they had used to get started with our product. But if we asked them, how did you get started, it was, I figured it out. If it was in the service of helping a coworker, then they were willing, and only then they were willing to tell us all the things that they had to do to work around. So again, we're in this scenario where we don't want to ask the right questions, people don't necessarily want to give us honest answers, and this a lot of times is going below the radar. This is subconscious. Most people do not come into an interview or write an email thinking, I am going to hide the truth from these designers and developers. They don't even really realize they're doing it most of the time. So they give answers that seem very rational. And you have probably heard these because I think these are probably the most common reasons that people will give you for stopping using your product, not using your product, not considering it. They'll say things like, it's too expensive, your competitor does it better, it was just too hard to use, it was missing features. And these all seem very reasonable to us, which is why we believe them. They are very rarely true. Something can be too expensive, but what that usually means is I'm not getting the value I expected for the money I'm giving you, as opposed to I literally can't afford it. Competitor is better just sounds easy, but again, what are they actually comparing to? What is the reason behind this? And of course, too hard to use, if it's generically too hard to use, it's not my problem, so again, I feel safe. And then missing feature, of course, we've all heard people who say, you need to add this, and actually very rarely is that the thing you need to add. But when we hear these answers, they seem very logical. If we're having some concerns about, is this going well, these feel like things where we can take action. Like we recognize steps we can do to combat each of these. We can lower the price. We can add more value. We can copy what our competitor is already doing. We can add a tour so people know how to use it. That is never the solution, by the way. No one has ever really benefited from a tour. We can add this feature that people asked for. But I think everyone in here has had that experience where someone asked for a feature, and you built the feature, and then they were still not happy. Either they used that feature, and it didn't work for them, or they just never used it. And you're like, wait a second, you asked for this. And it's kind of like when your kid asks for something for dinner, and you make it, and then they're like, I'm not hungry. And it's extremely frustrating. We don't want to be in this situation. So how do we get out of this? Because this is a mess. It's extremely frustrating to everyone, because your users are also kind of thinking, why can't these people get it together and make this app that is actually going to solve my problem? And the answer is surprisingly simple, because it does not require any special tools or any special software or any special training other than what you're going to hear in the next few minutes. You ask open-ended questions. In fact, this is not even a question. Tell me about the last time you did this. And the beauty of this is, you notice it's the last time, and there's a reason for that. It's because we're actually much more honest about the last time we did something than the present, or especially the future. People are terrible predicting the future. I don't even know what I'm going to do tonight, let alone in 6 months. And yet we ask people all the time, how likely are you to make this decision in the next 6 months? And they answer. They answer with confidence, and they also know they don't know. So we say, tell me about the last time you did this. And what happens is most of us have been conditioned to be polite, so we'll give a short answer. And then you kind of say, tell me more. Or you make encouraging noises, or whatever will help them keep going. Tell me more. Oh, that's interesting, keep going. Oh no, I'd really love to hear more about this. And you have to be very encouraging, because especially, culturally this varies how much people are willing to give you of a story. So I've done this same workshop in Denmark, and they're like, look, our customers really don't want to talk that much. I'm like, you have to just keep prodding and prodding to get the whole story out of a Nordic audience, apparently. But eventually you will, because humans really do like talking about themselves. So once we get over that initial awkwardness of not wanting to feel stupid, then we're off to the races. And the reason we do this, tell me about the last time, is we're tapping into recognition and sort of recall. And when we recognize something, it's like we've just pulled on a string and got the whole story out, and so now it's in front of us, and we're basically, in our brains, just reading off everything that happened last week or last month, or whenever the last time is we did this activity. And so we're not stopping to reconstruct it at all. We're basically just summarizing all the stuff that is locked away in our brains. So, the last time I sent out a mass email, well, I went to this, I got the list, I uploaded the list, then I double-checked it. Then I worried about if there were, it had mistranslated the umlauts, and so I went and I checked that, and then I sent a test mail, and then I sent another test mail. They'll go on and on. When you ask someone, how do you do this, or how will you do this, now we are recalling. And recall is an active process, and it means that as we're reconstructing this memory or this thought, we're making stuff up. And again, this is not on purpose. It's just that that's what our brains do. When we actually think back to memories, it's very easy for people's memories to change over time, because as we recall them, we add these bits of detail, which is why sometimes, if you've ever told a story and then your mother looks at you and is like, that's not how that happened, it's because over the years you've been reconstructing it, and so over 20 years, maybe it's morphed entirely. So this seems like a really subtle detail, but it actually makes a huge difference. And like with many things, doesn't feel natural. And so if you ask someone, how do you do this, you can actually immediately stop them and say, hold on, let me rephrase. The last time you did this, could you walk me through how it went? And that stopping and reframing is fine. People will not mind. And the trick still works. You will still get this great recognition instead of recall. We want to ask open-ended questions. And by that, I really just mean any question that can't be answered with yes or no. And the reason here goes back to that social desirability bias I talked about, which is that almost all yes-no questions have a right answer, an answer that sounds good and responsible and noble, and an answer that maybe is not so good. So if you ask me, did you have a lot of glasses of wine last night? Of course, the responsible answer, well, I don't know, we're in Italy, maybe the responsible answer is different, but, the responsible answer is, of course, no, I had a talk first thing in the morning, why would I do that? But the truth, some of you out there know the truth, which is, of course, I did. But if you had asked this as, how many glasses of wine did you have? Or even better, how many glasses of wine did you have after I left? Then you will get an honest answer, because somewhere implied in that question is that, of course, you had more wine. Like, of course you sometimes speed. Of course you sometimes yell at your kids. Of course you sometimes read the spoilers instead of watching the movie or reading the book. Like, we all do this. And so anything with yes, no usually has a right answer, and people will give you that right answer, even though that's not accurate. So instead of saying, would you like this feature, you could say, how would you use this feature if you'd had it in the past month? How would it have benefited you? See, we're doing two things there. We've got open-ended, and we're looking at the past. And so now you have a good chance of getting a story out of someone. Instead of saying, was this difficult? Was this process difficult? You could say, what was the most frustrating part of this experience? And people aren't really expecting you to lead with a negative like that, but it actually gives them permission to complain, because now they don't have to feel bad. Because as a user, if I'm ever sitting by someone who has designed a feature, part of me is like, I don't want to hurt their feelings, especially as someone who builds things. I know how hard it is to build something, and so if I'm looking at someone and I think something is terribly hard to use, the last thing I want to do is be like, wow, you're a terrible designer. This took me forever to figure this out. So I'm going to soft pedal my words unless you come out with what was the most difficult thing. And then I kind of feel like, they can take it. All right, I'm going to tell them, this page I could not figure out in the slightest. And that's information that you need to know. Because if you don't know it, you will keep making the same mistakes. Now, what did you find the most difficult? When did you have trouble with this? When was this frustrating? When could you have used this? Who on your team would benefit the most? All of these are fantastic questions. And again, if you start by asking a yes-no question, which you will, because these are what we want to ask. They come out very naturally. Would you like this? Don't you think? Shouldn't we? And all of those make the person on the other side want to agree with you, and then you learn nothing. And even if they are honest and you ask a yes-no question, sometimes you will get an answer like, no. And now you've got to figure out how to pick up the conversation and get going, because you've lost the rhythm entirely. It's terrible. So you ask this open-ended question. You start with a yes-no question, because you will. Would you like, let me rephrase. How beneficial would it be to have this feature? Where might this be most valuable in your workflow today? And again, you can stop midstream and reframe. The trick still works. The other is yes and the people who were in my workshop yesterday heard me talking about yes and, which I love, the principle of improvisation. So when you hear someone say something, the first thing you do is agree with them, even if they are wrong, and sometimes they will be wrong, but that's okay, because it gets you nowhere. Yes, and I'm also wondering, and then you can change the topic. You can actually do a complete 180, and people do not notice. If you say yes, and you just go a completely different direction, because they're not in that defensive stance that we get in when people say, but, because that immediately wants you to fight your corner. And I think one of the things that has happened the most often, where I see this fighting, this arguing, and people are trying to be helpful, is when you've all had the experience where someone says, your product is missing this feature. And you're thinking, no, it's not. I built that feature. And you're so excited, you want to tell them right now. Like, no, you're wrong, we have it. I'll show you where it is. And that is a missed opportunity. So someone says, your product doesn't do this. And you say, is good if you don't really want to say yes. I'm curious, if we had that feature, where do you think you would find it? And watch to see where they go. I'm guessing that's not where it is. But now you have learned something, which is that this person expected that feature to be in this place. And that's a useful hypothesis. And now you can go see, are there other people who all expected it to be here? Did they all click under this menu, see nothing, and conclude that we did not have this feature? That's a pretty easy fix. That's way easier than building a whole new feature. So we yes and all the time. If you're particularly close to a product, I find it's useful to have a partner in the room with you. It's because they can stop you from doing that thing where you want to argue. And someone says something, you're like, and they can kind of kick you under the table or like make that face at you. Again, when I did DevTools research, I would have a developer in the room with me, and someone would talk about the problem with some dev library, and their eyes would light up. They'd be like, ooh, I have the answer to this. I want to tell them how to fix it. I'd just be like, let's pay attention to what's frustrating first. You can email them later to tell them how to fix it. So yes, and you learn a tremendous amount from that. So what does this sound like in practice? Because I think the hardest thing I found over the years is I tell people to put these things into practice. They say, these feel unnatural to me. And they do. I think if people have heard of the concept of the 5 whys, like you ask why, and then you ask why again, and what you're trying to get to is a root problem. If you have ever tried doing that to a client, it feels incredibly rude. You feel like these people will never want to work with me again. Because why sounds very accusatory. Like, why do you want that? Why would that happen? And then they're kind of like, oh, I feel bad. My brain feels stupid, and I want to get out of this, so maybe I don't want to work with you. But instead, let's say someone tells you that something is too expensive, which they will because, as we know, it's a perfectly rational sounding answer. And instead, you say, tell me about how you're using it. Because maybe what you discover is that instead of using the product the way you had envisioned, they are using it in another completely weird way in which they are getting about this much value, and no wonder they think it's too expensive. You were expecting that it would do all these things for them, and they're getting 5% of the value, and of course that's a terrible deal for them. So let's figure out how to unlock more of that. It could be that they are genuinely not using your product very often, maybe because they can't find that feature because they looked in this place and that's not where it was. It may be that it's just not a part of their workflow, and sometimes you can't fix that. But it's really good to know, because if you figure out that someone has an established workflow and you don't really fit within it, adding more features is not going to make you fit within that workflow. It may be that this is just not a good customer fit. And so with that too expensive, of course we don't argue. We say, yeah, I can see that. Tell me about how you're using it. Tell me about the value you are getting. Sometimes you can even ask, for the value you're getting, what do you think would be a fair price? And again, that might identify this person as not a customer. If they say, I don't want to pay for anything, for most of us, that doesn't work because we all have to have salaries. But, don't accept the too expensive as face value, because that is very rarely the truth. It is almost always, I'm not getting sufficient value, it's not a good fit. It's too hard to use. Oh, could you walk me through how you're using it? Last time you did this, how long did it take? What have you used in the past that was easier? And sometimes going to talk about other tools or other websites is actually a really good way to get people to be honest, because now they don't really need to critique your stuff. So if they feel the least bit awkward about, I don't want to make this designer feel bad, they designed this whole interface, I don't want to tell them how terrible it is, but they're willing to tell you, this is a tool I love, this is why I love it, this is how it fits in my flow, you can glean something from that as well. Usually when something is too hard to use, it's not actually that it's too hard to use, it's perhaps that it requires a lot of attention, a lot of focused attention, and I can't possibly do it while I'm riding the subway and I'm holding on to something and I'm trying to do it on my phone, and that's too distracting. And I'll tell you, I have done a ton of transactions one-handed, either because I have a child nearby, or I'm on the subway, or I'm carrying something. And if I cannot transfer funds like this, it's not happening, not using your product. So that walk me through how you're using it, you want to understand. And this one will feel terrible to you, by the way. I'm not going to pretend this is easy. If you don't feel bad after having a conversation like this, you're not doing it right. I like to have customer interviews, and then I'll go have some chocolate or a glass of wine, because I'm like, this was torturous. I learned a lot, and I feel really bad, and I need to restore my equilibrium. But it's for a good cause. And it feels better than spending 6 months building something and then having no one use it, which is the worst feeling and cannot be cured with wine or chocolate. The competitor is better. Great. Tell me about how. This, again, we feel awkward about this one. Maybe we shouldn't be asking. I'm always telling people, why do you love Canva? Tell me about it. How do you use it? What's great about it? I want to hear more, because this is super valuable to me. And not because of the features, but because of what makes people feel smart and what makes them feel confident, and when they feel like they click on something and it just works and it meets their expectations. It's fantastic. What's the benefit you get from using this competitor? What other solutions have you found really useful? And again, all of these things give you insights into that stuff that's hard for people to put into words, that I see lots of options, I know what to expect, I feel smart doing this. Missing feature Those of you who work in enterprise software, there's an extra dimension here, which is sometimes you're missing this feature is just a way for people to say, I'm trying to bargain down my resubscription costs. But a lot of times people ask for a missing feature because as humans, we're really good at jumping to solutions instead of understanding the problem. And so if someone says, you need to do this, it's like, you're right, we don't have that. If you had it, how would it have helped you recently? What would you have been able to do that you can't do today? And this should be unlocking a story for someone. And this is like one of the most useful things is if someone says you need this feature, and I say, great, tell me how you would use it. And they say, it would just be good to have. That's not something you should build. That is not a customer need. Customers who need something can tell you a story about how it fits in their workflow, how something's screwed up without it, what other things they should do. They're very good at this. What are you unable to do without it? And what this really does is help you unlock the difference between something that is a nice to have, sure, that would be great, and the kind of thing that makes them decide, like, yes, I am going to buy this again, I am going to subscribe again, I'm not going to look at other competitor products. So all of these things get back to we're human, this is how our brain works. And again, this feels really uncomfortable. But what you will actually get to by having this type of open-ended question is that you will understand what customer problems are. And you will hear things, if you get them talking, you will hear things that sound on the surface very, very simple, very basic. Every time I load this page, it just takes a few too many seconds to load. Every time I click here, I was looking for this, and then I don't quite get what I expect. I always start this, and then I get an error. They're tiny things. And people around you may feel like these aren't really important, but they are. And I think over the past 20 years, as much as people have said things like, you're missing this feature, it's hard to use, what it really comes down to are these little tweaks of, I lose 5 seconds every time I do this, I feel a little bit dumb every time I do this, I make this mistake and I have to backtrack at least once a day, I thought something was going to happen and I ended up with something completely different. Those are the things that make us very uneasy. And you'll catch that when you're talking to people because you'll start hearing emotion in their voices. And you'll go from someone who's like, oh yeah, I do this and that's fine, and then I go through this step. And sometimes they're mad, sometimes they're happy, sometimes they seem really embarrassed. But any place where someone really deviates from their normal speaking voice is a place to pay attention, because that means there's something that is focused that is bothering them every time they use it. So your job is to keep saying, tell me more, until you know how your customer is behaving and feeling. And after a while, you will start getting a sense for these are the things that confuse people. These are the things that people have an expectation of. And again, it will not look anywhere near as neat as it's too expensive, but this is really what will make people make a decision to stick with you or not. All right, thank you, everyone.